Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Travis and Vic's Adventures. And this morning I'm tired, but I am happy to be joined by a very, very talented author, Peter Watts. How you doing, Peter?
I'm doing just fine. I actually should be thanking you for this. I'm supposed to be working on a black metal Norwegian fish opera, and it's kind of kicking my ass. So basically, any excuse I have to take a break and do something else is something I'm grateful for.
It's funny you
I actually
talk
don't
about
even know what we're talking about.
Well, it's funny you talk about the opera. I actually had somebody on once upon a time who he helped lead the opera about Elizabeth Bathory overseas. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, interesting process for that whole thing. I mean, obviously they had to dramatize it a lot. So, you're mixing history with dramatization.
Well, I don't know really why you necessarily have to dramatize a story about a woman who takes naked baths in the blood of virgins. I mean, that seems fairly dramatic inherently on its own.
Well, the story goes that was just legend, and that the rest of it was, the fact that she was cruel and things like that. And plus, whenever you see dramatizations, because males enjoy good-looking women, they kind of change her look from, a little bit overweight, maybe a little bit homely, to a beautiful, I don't know, vampire-type look. You know what I mean? Something
I did
for
not
the males.
know that Elizabeth Bathory was actually supposed to be overweight, but
well, slightly.
I guess that's actually kind of a good thing. Obviously,
yeah,
he was eating something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the subject of today, and it's nice that you get a little break here, is to talk about the things. The reason why I bring up the things is because I kind of have a tradition around January every year, and it started for the last few years. Obviously, John Carpenter's The Thing is a classic. It came out the year I was born, 1982. And whenever it gets cold, I kind of get the feeling, okay, I need to watch something like this. And this, John Carpenter's The Thing is the thing that I, no pun intended, that I always feel like kind of gets me in the winter mood. But here in recent years, I actually caught on to your adaptation, or whatever you want to call it, a different perspective of it called The Things. And I had heard Kate Baker from Clarkesworld do the audio. Well, I would call it a dramatization, but it's more a reading of The Things. And, she spoke very, very highly of you. And, I did some research, and then I got into all the other things you've done. And to get into all those things would take up more than 30 minutes, so I don't want to, take up too much of your time, but I do want to talk about The Things. Can you remember where the concept came from for you whenever you got started with the idea of this perspective from the alien?
Well, I've always loved the movie, right? Even when everybody hated it, even when everyone was shitting on it when it first came out because it wasn't E.T. The first time I saw it, I was just blown away. For the first time, we see a monster which is actually smart, right? Something that is actually two steps ahead of the humans. We're actually talking about a chess game, with chess, of course, being a motif throughout the movie, which I thought was a massive improvement over the original Howard Hawks version, where you basically are told that we have a highly intelligent alien here, but every time you see it, all it's really doing is roaring and smashing things. But as far as that went, that was it. It was just a favorite movie of mine. Sometimes when I was, doing natural history of Wales field trips on the East Coast, and it was foggy and we couldn't go out, I would force everybody in the class to watch The Thing. But I never really thought of adding to canon myself until I read this paper about a technical paper essentially describing us, all life on the planet now, as life 2.0. And life 1.0, according to this paper, was cancer. And, well, something like cancer. And that what we have in terms of modern cancer is kind of a vestige of that old life form. And they trotted out various arguments about, cancer it builds its own life support system, it builds its own vascular system. It's not just a proliferation of cells; it's got adaptations, and that paper itself has been roundly criticized in the literature since. So I'm not saying that it was world-class science, but it got me thinking about this being a potential model for an alien of the sort that you see in The Thing to work, almost a Lamarckian as opposed to a Darwinian kind of adaptation. And at that point I thought, wow, I could write this story and it could be called The Things, and humans would be the things, and it would be great. And so I started basically to write a piece of fanfic. And about a third of the way through, I realized, I can fix the problems with the movie, because it was a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. But let's face it, there are some glitches. Back in 1982, what are the odds that you're going to get a PC that comes preloaded with software that allows you to test to see whether your friends have been taken over by shape-shifting aliens, right? Like, they're just that wasn't even a necessary scene. It's perfectly obvious what's going on. These days you probably get one you get that kind of software loaded onto your iPhone by default, but back then it just seemed unreasonable. So now I had the idea, not only was I going to write fanfic, but I was going to fix some of those problems. I was going to kind of retcon some of the issues that I had with it. And at about the 2/3 mark, I realized, holy shit, I'm not really writing about The Thing at all. I'm writing about the missionary impulse. I'm writing about the colonists that sort of go into darkest Africa and decide they're going to civilize the savages, because ultimately that's what The Thing decides to do. It's going to rescue us from our way of life and impose its own with nothing but the best intentions. And at that point, I kind of figured that I had something. When I finished writing the story, I was afraid that it was more clever than good, if that makes any sense. So I didn't really know how it was going to fly, but it seems to have flown just fine, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the one of the many interesting things about it is that at least in the beginning, and for the majority of the story, there's nothing villainous about The Thing or the alien itself. It has opinions of things, and you kind of explore an idea, and you don't go too deep into it. But it's something that Blair kind of mentions in the movie, is that it could have been on a million worlds and all sorts of civilizations, and that's something you talked about. And I always like to think about that in terms of some of these locust-like aliens, like in To Serve Man from Twilight Zone. I always think, I wonder how many planets they've been to, and that was something that you kind of touched on as well in this.
Yeah. No, it's probably the closest thing to a strain on the story that would break the load-bearing struts would be the whole idea that it's been everywhere in the universe, or all sorts of places throughout the galaxy at least. And this is the first place it's encountered Darwinian natural selection, where things die and where the only way to persist is to create copies of yourself. The premise, the fundamental premise of the story, of my story, is that life on this planet followed a completely different evolutionary track than it has anywhere else, and that we are kind of unique. That's probably implausible. Darwin principles seem sufficiently simple and powerful that they're probably ubiquitous. And there's kind of a Darwinian. The Thing is a Darwinian creature anyway. It just doesn't have to create copies of itself because it is its own set of copies. It just has to make. Pardon me, I'm becoming increasingly inarticulate. But it's basically proliferating using a different strategy than life on this planet has come up with. And yeah, I do like the idea of it having that incredible legacy. And even more, I like the idea that it doesn't have the legacy, that it lost most of the legacy when it lost most of its biomass, and that it's just this fragment of what it once was, and it has these half memories, and it knows that it knew stuff, but it doesn't know what that stuff is anymore just because there's not enough biomass left to hold the information. I thought that was kind of cool.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then you talked about it earlier, some of the issues with the movie. I mean, obviously the movie is a classic. It's fantastic. But if you really take it, a microscope and look at it, there's certain things that you wonder outside of the computer, like, when was this person assimilated? Who, is this one? Is this one? And you really get into that. I mean, especially when they're all sitting there tied to the chair, and you explain why the blood reacts for one, but maybe not so much for the others, even if they are infected. And that's something that I would think, I don't know, that would take a lot of explanation on your part, and I think you did a hell of a job with that. I mean, because I think that's a difficult thing to do.
Well, thanks. It's always kind of a problem of my writing. You might want to just stop after the things because the rest of my stuff is a bit technical. And like one of my novels is actually been used as a textbook in neurology courses. And that's not really the kind of thing you want to stick as a blurb on the front of a science fiction novel. So pulse pounding, it's used as a neurology textbook. But yeah, I mean, my formal background is in biology. So it's a line I am constantly walking. I do not want to sort of pontificate. I do not want to info dump. I do not always succeed in that. But if you think I pulled off, a certain complexity of ideation in that story without boring the hell out of people, then, I guess my job here is done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was technical in terms of the words you used, but it's one of those things where if you're paying attention, you know exactly what you're saying, even if you're, a layman and you're not deep into science and things like that. And that's something that you had talked about in previous interviews, because I went searching the globe for Peter Watts, different things you've done, just so I was prepared today. And one of the things you had talked about
hang on, just to be clear to you and to your readers, I am not the Peter Watts of the same age who was arrested for possession of child porn in Upper Dickers back in the last decade. I just, I want to make that clear. The very first time I had like any kind of big publicity was when Wired Online interviewed me, and I was telling all my friends to check Wired Online and to Google me for, Wired Online, and on exactly that same day, Peter Watts from Upper Dickers was arrested for possession of child porn. And there was some confusion. So just to clear that up preemptively.
Anyhow, sorry, not good confusion for you. Yeah, I totally understand. But no, I made sure that I had the right one for sure. And one of the things that you had talked about previously a little bit, and you just alluded to it there, is, coming from the scientific field, and you're biologist, a former biologist. Although technically, if you're a biologist, do you stay a biologist forever? How's that work?
Well, nobody revoked my PhD once I started writing science fiction or anything. But let's face it, science marches on. So a PhD that I got in the early 90s, it's got a half-life. Sits there on the shelf for a while. Most of the stuff I know now might be, if not obsolete, certainly dated. It's not cutting edge. There is, you try to stay current, but I find it interesting that the work that I'm most famous for really is stuff that involves a lot of neurology, which I have no formal background in at all. I've got postdocs in neuro who say that they keep a copy of Blindsight on their lab desk, and that's. It's odd. I don't think it's expertise on my part. So perhaps it's just a fresh perspective. Maybe when you're sort of outside of that field, you're not encrusted with the same dogma, so you can see things with a different perspective. You don't have the same set of cataracts, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert on it at all. And even the things that I was expert on, I'm probably not anymore. I mean, when I was doing my my PhD, we were gluing radio transmitters the size of cigarette boxes onto harbor seals. and all we could get from them was just sort of a location. We'd have to wander around with our Yagi antennas. And these days, my God, I mean, you put something the size of a rice grain into a herring, let them swallow it, and you've got blood chemistry, you've got digestive status. It all goes up to an Argo